The issue of policing and how policing communities of color was raised this evening at the debate. And there was a really stark contrast between how both of these vice presidential candidates view this issue. Let's check out the clip.
Those who say we should not be able to bring up and talk about bias in the system will never solve the problem.
When an African-American police officer is involved in a police action shooting involving an African-American, why would Hillary Clinton accuse that African-American police officer of implicit bias?
I guess I can't believe you are defending the position that there is no bias and it's a topic we don't
Governor
need
Pence,
to talk
I have a
about.
question.
A really interesting misunderstanding there expressed from Governor Mike Pence. This sort of belief that if a black police officer shoots and kills a black person who is perhaps unarmed or not, that somehow that police officer can't be demonstrating any implied bias or racial bias against a fellow person of color, when we know that studies have demonstrably proved this to be false. There's a big difference the way Republicans and Democrats see this issue, Bill. How do you think both of the candidates responded tonight when it was raised?
Well, I thought that, again, I just in a stylistic point for Kaine, I thought that, like most Democrats of our time, too much time has been spent with pollsters and consultants, and they go to these debates loaded up with a half dozen zingers that they're just trying to land, and with some somewhat formulaic points to make, and so the actual, the polemical act of debating is sometimes neglected. When Pence said, I don't see how you can talk about systemic bias. I don't see how you can talk about implied racism or bias. And then a minute later says, and we passed criminal justice reforms. I was waiting for Kaine to say, the reason you had to pass criminal justice reforms, and your criminal justice reforms weren't very good reforms, secondly, but the reason you did was because it was a recognition of bias. That's why we had to reform the system. Almost all the criminal justice reforms on the table right now are themselves a recognition of institutional bias. The Republicans have all copped to it. They've all said by supporting these bills that it exists. And then the second thing is, the problem isn't that Mike Pence really doesn't believe that there's bias in the system. The problem is that his remedies are so weak. The bills he passes, he increased mandatory sentencing for drug offenders in Indiana. It's insane. So there were times when I just wanted to, I think that the difference was clear. Our guy's better, but there were times when I wished he could have picked apart that other argument a little more forcefully and systematically. That's all.
Kate, quickly, your thoughts about how Tim Kaine referenced the killing of Philando Castile, who was a school worker who had no criminal record, who was shot and killed by police with his fiancee and his child in the car. And then Mike Pence doubling down on how Donald Trump is a candidate of law and order and how he received a big endorsement from the Fraternal Order of Police.
Right. And I just to start off, I think the mentioning of Philando Castile is really to the credit of the Movement for Black Lives and all the people who have been really flooding into the streets and holding politicians and holding, people like Hillary Clinton accountable to these movements' demands and to these communities' needs. And so I think that was really sort of telling for me, in that, this isn't something that would have happened, in 2012, say. But I think to go sort of further down that point, you're seeing kind of a growing rift between the Republicans and Democrats on this point, again, because of the influence of these movements, and that Trump and Pence are really doubling down on this very scary kind of form of law and order neoliberalism, as sort of simple as that, and that they're drumming up fear about communities of color, both African-American communities, immigrant communities, to serve a really regressive agenda. And I think it's, again, in line with the Republican Party. The Republican Party's project for the last several decades has been premised both on criminalizing people of color, most especially Black communities, and disenfranchising them economically. And so I think, this is really an extension of a really scary and really painful drive on the right to go there, to really drive forward some really scary reforms on their part. And I think we're starting to see this sort of corrective on that. But I think it's a real sort of telling illustration for what a Trump administration would look like to see Pence respond in that way.
All right. Well, the last issue that we're going to discuss this evening from tonight's debate is that of reproductive rights and the abortion issue. Let's check it out.
More and more young people today are embracing life because we know we're better for it. We can, like Mother Teresa said at that famous National Prayer Breakfast.
This is important.
Let's welcome the children into our world. There are so many families around the country who can't have children. If we could improve adoption so that families that can't have children can adopt more readily those children.
Why don't you trust women to make this choice for themselves?
Kate, as you mentioned that both of these candidates have a similar background in the sense that they are both of Irish Catholic descent, and Mike Pence has a very well-known record when it comes to dealing with issues of reproductive rights and being vehemently against a woman's right to choose and against having access to Planned Parenthood, of which he has drastically slashed funding in his state to some dire consequences.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's a real difference here again between Tim Kaine, who has said in the past he has a sort of personal opposition to abortion rooted in his faith, and to what seems to be an obsession that Mike Pence has with defunding Planned Parenthood and making abortion access harder for millions of women, and not just abortion access, but sort of routine health screenings, cancer screenings, STD testing, really basic services, and just sort of pulling that out from under the people who need it. And so I think it's really scary to be having this conversation in 2016. And of course, Planned Parenthood itself is under sort of constant attack from Pence and others kind of in his ideological cohort. But I think this is a really good testament to why we need to defeat this kind of myth that women can't make their own decisions for their bodies. And it might have been the best line of the night, Tim Kaine saying, "Why don't you trust women to make this choice?" And I think I'll be surprised if that's not what's kind of brought out tomorrow in reviews of tonight.
And Bill, when I talk about dire consequences of Governor Pence cutting the funding for Planned Parenthood in Indiana, there was an outbreak of HIV/AIDS in the wake of these funding cuts to Planned Parenthood because, as most people know, Planned Parenthood does a lot more than just abortions. They do testing and disease screenings and a myriad of other services. What were your thoughts about how these two candidates discussed the issue about a woman's right to choose tonight?
Well, again, I wish it had been a little bit clearer. The Republicans always want to just talk about Medicaid funding and the phrase they invented, partial birth abortion, and the country, a majority of the country has reservations about both those things, but a substantial majority is otherwise supportive of a woman's right to choose. And Mike Pence wants to get rid of that entirely. And Trump may or may not really want to. George Herbert Walker Bush didn't really want to. There's no question if you put all these guys on sodium pentothal, Planned Parenthood, they'd all admit it does mostly positive health work, and they're only doing it for political reasons. And on abortion, a lot of them know better. George Herbert Walker Bush was pro-choice all his life, and then appointed the most anti-choice justices we have. There's just there's a pact that's been made between the Republican Party and the far religious right on these kinds of issues. And I do think that, again, while the points could have been scored a little more cleanly, I thought that the difference was there for anyone who wanted to see it.
Bill Curry. He is a columnist for Salon.com. He's also formerly served as White House counsel to President Bill Clinton. And we've also been speaking with Kate Aronoff from New York. Kate is a writing fellow at In These Times, and she's been covering the 2016 election. We want to thank you both for staying up late and joining us and giving us your great analysis on tonight's debate. We appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the compliment. I enjoyed it very much.
Thanks so much.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.